Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Welcome to today's reading from Sri Damodara Janani, Lord Damodar's mother, written by His Holiness Sri Sivarama Swami. We are reading from chapter 2 at the moment. Krishna breaks the churning pot. At the moment, we've been reading that Krishna is really angry because Mother Yashoda has left him to check on the milk which was boiling on the stove, and Krishna was very hungry and he wanted to be fed, and instead Mother Yashoda has left him. So we'll continue reading from there onwards. Ukam karoti vachalam pangum langhayate girim yad kripa tamham bande Shri Gurum Dinatarinam Paramananda Madhavam Shri Chaitanya Ishwaram Hari Om Tat Sat. The birds led by Shuka and Shari, the two parrots, they have been contemplating that is Lord's anger valid? We'll continue with that discussion. The owl blinked to affirm the truth of what he had heard, and while Shari conclusion seemed to quell all dispute, a young songbird from Mathura raised a question that vexed the others. From scriptures we know that the Lord is always satisfied within himself and that he knows neither hunger nor thirst. Dear friends, is it not contradictory to say that Krishna is hungry and angry? The local birds were disturbed by this intrusion, but Shuka pacified them with a nod. After all, it was their duty to bring Vraja's visitors to a higher stage of understanding. Deferring to the wisest of them, Shuka nodded towards the owl, who replied, Who do you think Krishna is? A bit uncertain, the songbird looked at Krishna and then at the birds. He is the Supreme Lord. Having assumed the innocent form of a child, he is now pretending to be dissatisfied and angry in order to nourish the parental love of Mother Yashoda. The owl rotated his head in an expression of displeasure. You have come from Mathura, and so your perspective of Krishna's pastime is immature. Please listen. The other birds nodded in agreement, and with their eyes on Krishna, they cocked their feathery ears. Krishna is not acting. Dependence on his parents is a feature of his essential identity, his Swarupa Dharma, and from that dependence sprouts the inspiration by which he becomes the father of all living entities and hence their maintainer, Janardana. This child, Krishna, is the original feature of Godhead. He is not an expansion of Narayan. Rather, Narayan is his expansion. Therefore, whatever moods and gestures you see him express are spontaneous, not a show. Do you understand? The songbird understood. Elated by the association of Rajas birds, he began to sing sweetly, but Shuka commented for good measure. Mayavadi philosophers may argue that anger is a mundane emotion and that Lord should not exhibit any kind of 18 human defects. However, his anger is transcendental and an expression of divine love. When his divine anger is reflected off the mirror of matter, it is known as mundane anger and is an expression of frustrated want. Knowers of truth thus conclude that Krishna's pastimes in Vraja are not material but divine, not a performance but expressions of his identity. Shuka and others fell silent and turned their attention on Krishna, and just in time, Krishna's anger had not faded. Eager to express itself in a way that would fulfill his desires and precipitate another pastime, it soared. Outraged, Krishna looked around for something upon which to vent his fury. As his eyes fell on the churn, he reached out to grasp the churning rod. With no motive to do harm to his mother, but impelled by the ecstasy raging within, Krishna tried to raise the rod but could not. It remained tied to the pillar. He tugged, but it held fast. He by whose will alone devotees are freed from the three modes of nature failed to sever three silken ropes. The pastime potency would not have it. His attempt thwarted Krishna's anger rose further. The churn could see what was coming, but it was not anxious about its fate. It existed for Krishna's pleasure, and being fully surrendered, it accepted that fate. It existed for Krishna's pleasure, and being fully surrendered, it accepted that fate, knowing that it would remain always a servant of the Lord. On the previous day, Krishna had collected some stones from the courtyard and brought them into the house. His lotus eyes now fell on a small pointed stone that was part of a broken pestle. Reaching down, he artfully held the stone like a dagger and then struck the bottom of the churn with the pointed edge, once, twice. Meanwhile, Mother Yashoda had removed the pot of milk and was fussing over the stove to lower its heat. Krishna cast a guilty glance in her direction. Noting that she had not heard him but remained preoccupied, he struck again, thrice. The pot cracked neatly in two with just the slightest sound. Pleased with his own antics, Krishna betrayed himself with a mischievous smile. "Oh, that servant girl," Yashoda muttered, and with her back towards him added, "Just a minute, darling, I shall be right there." But the son of Nanda was preoccupied. As the yogurt flowed steadily through the cracked churn and onto the floor, he tapped the pot with his forefinger and the churn silently split into two halves in the way palace gates open to receive a king. The sound of the breaking churn resembled the Brahmanas chanting of Swaha as they pour libations onto the sacrificial fire. The splatter of yogurt and butter resembled their subsequent prayer, "Idam Krishnaya idam na mama," and the churning rod rubbing against the pillar was the tinkling sound of the bell Brahmanas ring during the food offering to the Lord. Hunger prodded Krishna forward. "Just see this delicious feast." Heeding his advice, Krishna crawled through the churned butter, but by the time he reached the broken churn, its contents had spilled onto the floor. Not a drop of uncontaminated butter remained. Thwarted again, Krishna's hunger also transformed to anger. His chakora-like eyes brimming with tears, Krishna clenched the two rows of his moon-like teeth, tinted red by the rays of his ruby lips. He had taken so much effort, risked so much, and was no better off than before. "One more moment, darling," but Krishna did not have another moment. Indignantly splashing the spilled yogurt here and there, determined to satisfy his hunger at all costs, Krishna resolved to raid the storeroom. His feet covered in buttery yogurt, the confirmed butter thief headed into the bedchamber, leaving telltale footprints wherever he went. When Krishna reached the almirah in the dressing salon, he knew that he was entering uncharted waters. Never before he had been so daring. Although he was ruthless at the neighbors, he was always careful not to upset his mother at home. Good domestic conduct assured him of a royal protection from village complainants. But this was something new. "I do not care." The birds craned their necks and watched as Krishna lifted the key from a drawer and now, in a fearful yet playful mood, romped through the room, smearing the walls and furniture with his yogurty hands. The thrill of mischief was intoxicating, and in such an inebriated state, Krishna lost sight of right and wrong. Noticing the watching birds, he threw them a glance and said, "If you want to be fed here in the future, be sure that you do not see anything." Obedient, the birds turned their backs to the palace and looked out on Gokula town. What an eventful morning. Shall we peek? No, unless you want to end up like the sons of Maharaj Sagar. With no witnesses about and comforted by the sight of his mother mopping up the spilt milk, Krishna stepped into the reception room very quietly, slipped the key into the storeroom door and turned it. The lock made a soft click and the door gave way. Krishna entered the storeroom and again closed the door behind him, but not for long. Invoking his divine effulgence, they were too high for him to reach. Scanning the storeroom, he saw a tall mortar in which his mother would grind spices. Then he, who was unable to reach the pots, now moved the heavy mortar in place, and stepping on a crate of vegetables, scaled the motor to within reach his goal. For a moment, Krishna stopped to hear that his mother was doing what his mother was doing. That silly servant girl, she muttered. She is still preoccupied, he whispered. Removing a few pots with great effort, Krishna placed them at his feet and then crawling to the ground, he used the motor as a picnic table over which he leaned casually. Finally, he had what he wanted, yesterday's freshly churned butter. Curious to see if the contents were identical, Krishna ripped off their cloth coverings and sampled the butter from each pot, all the while making pleasant sounds of satisfaction. Some pots had been earmarked for yogurt, some for ghee, and some for butter. They were all heavenly. He could discern no difference between them. His mother was an unparalleled master in the art of making butter. The taste of the butter was incredible, but the truth of the matter was that it was not what butter was normally like. It looked like butter and felt like butter, but it was not. It was Mother Yashoda's love for him in the form of dairy. The sensation of dipping his hands into the butter was the same as being held in her embrace. The taste of the butter on his tongue was the same as the taste of her breast milk, and the effect on his eyes of seeing the butter was the same as seeing her transcendental form. Was it butter? No, it was more like Mother Yashoda, and the combined impact of these sensations seemed to bring Yashoda in Krishna's presence, and so for a moment he panicked, thinking that she had entered the storeroom. Then regaining his composure, Krishna continued to savor the butter, but as usual, he restrained himself from eating too much. If I overeat, then the effect of this butter will subdue me, make me submissive to Mother, and bring this pastime to an end. This was the reason he always stole the neighbor's produce and not his mother's. Yashoda's dairy was so saturated with her incomparable love that it would immediately bridle him and bring him under her control. Such an outcome would be incompatible. It would mean no more stealing and no more mischief, since the neighbor's produce lacked the intensity of Yashoda's love. It lacked the same controlling power. He could therefore freely plunder their homes without fear of becoming a docile do-gooder and the laughing stock of his friends. But this morning, Krishna's anger insulated him from the domesticating effects of his mother's butter. Bodily hairs erect and limbs trembling in ecstasy, he was able to savor the special tastes of her labors, and as he did so, he could not help but exclaim, But there was a problem. As he relished this special treat, it caused his anger to wane, and thus fear of his mother waxed. As his fear mounted, Krishna's appetite lessened, and like an ordinary child, his mind eventually became filled with doubt. What will happen when Mother sees the mess I made? And what if my friends came just now and tattled me on? What if some neighbors use this as evidence of their complaints to date? His fears, fueled by such thoughts, tears again welled up in Krishna's eyes, flowed down his cheeks and flooded his lips. Sniffling, Krishna wiped away his tears and in doing so smeared his face with butter. The evidence was now indelible. Who knows what she will do? With thoughts of punishment surfacing in his mind, Krishna, like all naughty boys, sought escape. The nearest door led to the grand hall where guards were stationed. They would immediately raise the alarm. That is not a good escape route. The only other way was back through the parlor between the kitchen and the bedchamber, and then down the back staircase to the courtyard, and that meant entering her line of vision. I can hide in the garden until Mother becomes so fearful at my disappearance that her anger abates. Krishna cocked his ears. What was she doing? There seemed to be no noise from the kitchen. She has finished cleaning up. He panicked. He who is feared by fear personifies, blanched, and his dark blue complexion turned a pale sky color. Tears continued to roll down his cheeks and his limbs shook. What will I do? How will I escape? Seeing that her lord required assistance, the pastime potency exerted her mystic influence over Mother Yashoda and made her unable to detect what happened next. Reassured by his divine aid, Krishna carefully opened the door but then stopped. With an impish smile, he turned back into the storeroom and embraced a pot of butter. Holding the pot to his chest, Krishna then passed through the door and skillfully braved the open spaces leading to the back stairway. Afraid to look in the direction of his mother, Krishna followed his own buttery footsteps, shedding false tears as insurance against caught. When he reached the broken churn, thrilled by the apparent victory of his caper, Krishna stomped around in the spilled produce for good measure. Then, feeling very satisfied with himself, he left through the back door and down the stairs into the courtyard. So this ends the second chapter. There's some short notes which I would like to read as well. Love of God is experienced in two ways: the joy of meeting and the joy of separation between Krishna and his devotee. While the joys of association are self-evident, those of separation are not. What is characteristic of separation is pain, which is identified with the effects of snake poison, and yet there is another experience in separation, and that is the transcendental bliss, which comes from a uniquely deep absorption in the beloved, an absorption that is equivalent to association. Thus, separation can also be viewed as another form of union. This is described by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as follows: My dear beautiful friend, if one develops love of Godhead, love of Krishna, the son of Nanda Maharaj, all the bitter and sweet influences of this love will manifest in one's heart. Such love of Godhead acts in two ways. The poisonous effects of love of Godhead defeat the severe and fresh poison of the serpent, yet there is simultaneously transcendental bliss, which pours down and defeats the pride of nectar and diminishes its value. In other words, love of Krishna is so powerful that it simultaneously defeats the poisonous effects of a snake, as well as the happiness derived from pouring nectar on one's head. It is perceived as doubly effective, simultaneously poisonous and nectarian. This is from Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita Madhya-Lila, 2nd chapter, verse 52. In the way that devotees experience such emotions in relation to Krishna, he also experiences same emotions in relation to them. But the wonder is that the bliss tasted by the devotee is greater than that tasted by Krishna. It is for this reason he appears as the greatest devotee, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. When Lord Shiva was angered by the misdeeds of his father-in-law Daksha, he invoked a demon by the name of Veerbhadra, who was known as the personified anger of Supreme Lord. Srimad Bhagavatam, 4th canto, 5th chapter, verse 5 says, Similarly, when Krishna becomes completely overwhelmed by anger, he manifests that transcendental form of Lord Nrsimha as described in the 7th canto. The symptom of anger described here are all transcendental and are elaborately illustrated in the Nectar of Devotion, chapter 47. Sanatana Goswami quotes the Bhakti Kavya of the poet grammarian Bhatti, in which the author gives examples of obscure rules of grammar. In this case, the grammar scrutinizes the words Mrisha, Ashura, Ashru that Srila Prabhupada and Acharyas in general translate as with false tears in the eyes. To exemplify that the false tears of Krishna do have some emotional and expressional basis, Sanatana Goswami cites a poem by Bhatti in which a lady demonstrates her fatigue with exaggerated movements and expressions. Such exaggeration may be called false mrisha because they do not accurately represent the extent of the lady's fatigue, but they are not totally false, for she is actually tired. Similarly, because there is a reason for Krishna's tears, they cannot be called absolutely false, but because he is drawing attention to himself and exaggerating his condition, his crying is disproportionate, and so it is false in a relative way. Sanatana Goswami adds further that since Shukadev Goswami is witnessing these pastimes within himself, he makes note of Krishna's exaggeration and is amused by it. Thus, when he says Mrisha Ashru, Shukadev is introducing a note of humor in his narration, humor that the astute reader can appreciate either directly or through the grace of the Acharyas. Such are the intriguing commentaries of Sanatan Goswami. The worship of Krishna by devotees in Mathura is mixed with knowledge of his divinity. This is the case with the young songbird, as we shall see. He raises the doubt that is common amongst his kind of devotee, which is that because Krishna is Supreme Lord, his Vraja pastimes are like a dramatic performance in which he is always aware of his divinity. But the Vrajavasi birds, like the devotees steeped in Vraja Bhakti, know that Krishna's Vrindavan pastimes are not a performance by the Lord, but rather an exhibition of his innermost identity. If anything, Krishna having to exhibit his godhood is a performance, but even then, he is fully absorbed in such a performance because that identity is also his eternal nature. Even if not his core identity, therefore, when the songbird raises questions about Krishna's divinity, although such truths are known to the Vrajavasi birds, for them it is a secondary and insignificant feature of Krishna. The name Janardana means the maintainer, Ardhana of living entities, Janardana means the maintainer, Ardhana of living entities, and Jana is the people and the living entities. The Nectar of Devotion, chapter 23, quotes the Vishnu Yamala Tantra, which describes the 18 symptoms of material contamination that are eternally absent in the Lord. These 18 are illusion, fatigue, errors, roughness, material lust, restlessness, pride, envy, violence, disgrace, exhaustion, untruth, anger, hankering, dependence, desire to lord over the universe, seeing duality, and cheating. This is for Krishna's pleasure, not mine. Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 9, Chapter 8 describes how Krishna's incarnation Kapila burned the ashes with his glance, the 60,000 sons of Maharaj Sagar. Next time we will begin with Chapter 4, Yashoda finds and catches Krishna. Thank you for joining in relishing these pastimes of Mother Yashoda and Krishna in Vraja. Next time we'll continue. Hari Om Tat Sat. Hare Krishna.